They are very sensitive to what happens in Western Ukraine. I have had Russians tell me, some in uniform, this is within the last few years, that they thought that the best solution was for the Poles to move into Western Ukraine, because within a very short period of time, there would be a Polish-Ukrainian war. And then the Russians would have less to worry about because the Ukrainians hate the Poles. And the Ukrainians hate a lot of people, not just Russians, all sorts of people. And the Poles have had their eye on that area. They ruled it for hundreds of years, obviously, but they've also had bad experiences. It was ultimately the Cossack rebellions that weakened Poland so much that it had to ultimately vanish from the map because it couldn't rule itself. So, the Russians know the history, and you're absolutely right. There is no interest in going into Western Ukraine under any circumstances. So the notion that was ever on anybody's mind is just nonsense. In fact, I think they would be very grateful if the Poles, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the people in Moldova and Romania would all sit down and say, look, let's sort this thing out. Let's come to some sort of agreement. And I think that could happen ultimately. But unfortunately, at the moment, we're making that impossible. You heard the announcement from Chancellor Merz, who now says there are no restrictions on the use of these strike weapons with a range of 300 miles or 500 kilometers. Well, this puts the Russians in a very difficult position. They made it clear this is unacceptable. So the question now is, how much do they put up with before Chancellor Merz wakes up in the middle of the night with a missile in his bedroom? And people don't think that's possible. They're wrong. The Russians have just about had it with this German government. And the Russians do not necessarily understand how this government can behave as it does when the overwhelming majority of Germans want nothing to do with this war in Ukraine, just as the overwhelming majority of Poles want nothing to do with it. They've been waiting for these people to change their governments. I know that for a fact. They've said clearly, give these people time. They'll put somebody else in power who makes sense, but it hasn't happened yet. I think, and I have a lot of friends in Germany, and I do talk to them, as you know, and they tell me there has been a sea change in public opinion in Germany. That, first of all, the Germans are sick of all the foreigners they have in their country. Not just Muslims. They're also sick of the Ukrainians who are in Germany, just as the Poles are sick of the 3 million Ukrainians in their country. A lot of people don't know it, but this is an interesting side. When the Ukrainians in Poland were asked what language they wanted their children to be instructed in, they all said Russian. The Germans are looking at this, and the average German on the street is, we're kind of fed up and disgusted with this. Now, what you're saying is that if Merz ends up with a missile in his bedroom, that the entire German nation is going to suddenly mobilize, equip, and march east. No, I don't see it. First of all, these military establishments in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, are so backward. They are so complacent. Their discipline is so poor. It would take a decade to recover from the current state of their armed forces. Now, they can certainly build missiles and rockets, but then again, you're just exchanging with the Russians. Look at the size of Russia. Look at the size of Germany. That's going to be a short exchange. I don't see the Germans doing that. I think the Germans are increasingly dissatisfied with Merz and everybody else. And the interesting thing is that, this has been wonderful for the Alternative für Deutschland. The AfD has benefited enormously from it, but they're also continually excluded from the policy process. They're kept out of everything. So if you look at this, it's kind of National Socialism in reverse. You've got this dictatorial regime in Berlin that wants to pursue policies that are fundamentally antithetical to the interests of the German nation, and they remain in power. And the one party that is absolutely opposed to war with Russia, it's opposed to deindustrialization, it's opposed to the destruction of the German economy, and it has recognized the futility and stupidity of trying to build an armed force right now to fight Russia. but they can't get into the policymaking process. Now, will this last forever? No, I don't think so. And I think what will happen is they will eventually gain power. But in the meantime, if the German people have any say in anything, and I think they would in the case of going to war with Russia, they would oppose it, especially since we've made it clear. And this is the other strange phenomenon. You have, on the one hand, Trump adopting the bellicose language, making these statements that have no bearing on reality, things that he rejected 120 days ago, 180 days ago. He wouldn't have said any of them. Now he's saying them, essentially repeating this sort of neocon globalist narrative about Russia. He's also saying he wants to get out of Germany. He wants to withdraw forces from Germany. Well, if you're a German and you say, well, the Americans want to get out. Look, one of the things in private conversation with him in November of 2020, he made it abundantly clear that he was deadly serious. And that wasn't the first time. He has long felt that the Europeans should be their own first responders. President Trump is not a fool. He understands, just as Eisenhower did in the 1950s, there will be no new Normandy invasion. It's not going to happen. We're not coming back with millions of troops. We can't do it. The technology of warfare has changed. And if we're going to send anything to anybody that's meaningful, it has to go by sea. And today, any convoy that crosses the Atlantic or the Pacific with large quantities of troops and materiel is going to be identified and ultimately destroyed, either by ground-based or air-launched precision missile strikes or by submarines. So it's over. And he knows it's over. The Europeans are in denial. They don't want to accept that, but they've got to come to terms with it. And you're right. First of all, and this is very important to understand, most Europeans cannot grasp this, and they need to get this. There is no strategy. None. The only thing that people want to do in Washington is to hold on to what exists. In other words, they are clinging tenaciously to the status quo, even though everybody privately knows we can't afford it. We can't maintain it. We can't sustain it. You know, it's kind of funny. People talk about $1 trillion defense budget, but at the same time, everybody sees what's happening in Japan and the collapse of the bond market. That's going to happen here. We're at roughly 4.5% on 10-year treasuries. Each month, this goes up a few points. At some point, it's going to rise quickly in a way that we cannot possibly imagine today, but it will, because we no longer have control. You can cut the interest rates, and the yield for treasury bonds goes up anyway, because people don't want to invest in us. We have been selling 2-year treasuries. Even that is now going to become a problem. Nobody wants to buy the 30 years anymore. And now we have the Japanese who've told us, look, we're in a lot of trouble. No hard feelings, but we're going to dump your treasuries. We're going to get rid of them. They're not worth anything. The Chinese are going to do it. And they are the last ones. People don't understand this. Chinese don't want to become the reserve currency. They're very happy to let us do it. They always have been. This is another myth, the evil China that wants to conquer the world and rule Asia. You know, if the Chinese truly wanted to rule Asia, there's an organization, it's called Tokyo. They'd have something to say about it. It's not going to happen. And the Vietnamese would never tolerate it either. And the last time the Chinese challenged the Vietnamese, that was a very unsatisfactory outcome. Look, we're living on Fantasy Island in Washington. Washington, D.C. is Fantasy Island. We can't afford any of it. We've spent ourselves into oblivion. We're headed into a severe recession that could become a depression, particularly if we end up in a war in the Middle East, which we haven't talked about. That would trigger catastrophe over here. We continue to lose control of industries. We just sold the last semblance of national power in the form of United States Steel to Japan. I mean, nobody that I knew when I was living in the 50s and 60s, if I told them the Japanese are going to buy U.S. steel, people would say it's impossible. You've lost your mind. We are in bad shape, Pascal. That's the truth. We have no no true sense of a balance regarding who we are and who others are. And this is dangerous. And it's very dangerous for the Europeans. The bad news is it sounds like Merz, Macron, and Starmer have contracted a similar disease. They don't realize what they're dealing with. I can't imagine Palmerston in England or Disraeli or Gladstone or anybody else treating the Russians with the same kind of disregard and contempt. They understand very well that Russia may be many things, but Russia is a great power, and it has enormous influence. You don't treat it badly, but we do. We treat other countries badly, and we think everyone should bow down to us. So I just want to get that across before we go into the Middle East, because these are things Europeans must understand about us. Keep in mind, I love my country, and I think Americans have many fine attributes, but we're talking about a government, not the American people. We're talking about a government with an unrealistic view of itself and the rest of the world. Remember, it's Fantasy Island. Nobody knows. Well, I mentioned the Cossack Rebellion. If you mention that on the Hill, people look at you and say, what? Oh, you mean these funny guys that wear funny hats and ride horses? I mean, that's the level of ignorance. This country is a planet on its own, literally. Europeans need to understand that, and they need to get a hold of people like Rubio and the State Department and others and say, look, talk to us. What are you really doing? Nobody really knows. You know, Trump has just made a number of contradictory statements, reversed himself completely, 180-degree turns from where he was a couple of months ago. And everybody acts like, well, that's no big deal. It's a very big deal. We need to get on board with the rest of the world. Well, you have to understand how people view conflict with Iran in Washington. The first thing they'll tell you is there will be no ground force involved. Well, that's true. We have none to send. Our army is pitifully small. It's in no condition to mount a major offensive on the ground anywhere in the world right now. The Marine Corps, which is usually used to extend or expand the army, is in no position to augment the army. It's gone through profound changes. It simply could not fight in this high-intensity conventional environment. So there will be no ground forces. That's the argument. And so the question is, what are you trying to achieve? And the two things that they want to talk about is, number one, they want to destroy Iran's capacity to enrich uranium. In other words, its nuclear underground development site. And number two, they will tell you, we really need to go after that regime. That's the problem. The Iranian people are ready to rebel against it. If we destroy the regime, the Iranians will take care of the rest. And they're convinced that if they use the munitions, conventional, that have been developed by the Air Force, these enormous, megaton bombs with conventional explosives, that are designed to penetrate and do enormous damage, as we've seen for instance, in Beirut when they killed the leader of Hezbollah. Those munitions can be used, and they think they will be successful. So that's the way they view it. And then they say, we have to add to all of this, obviously, the fleet and the rest of the Air Force, so we can destroy their integrated air defenses. And when you say, well, are you sure about that? And do you think you can actually penetrate deeply into their airspace and deliver these munitions? Oh, of course. Absolutely. So I think there is a great deal of confidence in the supremacy of the United States Air Force and the United States Navy's Air Force and missile arsenal. And they think they can achieve that outcome. Now, right now, it's pretty clear that President Trump does not want war with Iran. When I talked to him at the same time we were discussing withdrawing forces from Germany, it was very clear to me he didn't want a war with Iran. This is not someone who wants war. Well, that's fine. Then you need to prevent it. And at this point, he's not in a position to do so. Because if Mr. Netanyahu, one way or another, starts the war and ends up flying against Iranian air defenses and delivering whatever munitions he has, and he has virtually everything that we do at this point, or even worst case, decides to use a low-yield nuclear weapon to destroy the site, which I think would be a catastrophic error, but it's on the table for the Israelis, we would inevitably be dragged into this on their side. And that goes back to the control and influence that he has on the Hill. And all you have to do is listen to the people on the Hill. Listen to these senators speak. Yeah. You know, did you hear this man Kennedy, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, who said, I think Mr. Trump has been dishonored and insulted by Mr. Putin. I think we should turn Russia into fish food. Please stop and think about that. It's a statement of incalculable stupidity and ignorance, but that passes for serious thinking on the Hill. Look at Lindsey Graham. Go down the whole list of senators, and it's not just Republicans. There are plenty of Democrats who agree. This is the uniparty. The uniparty supports war. So I don't think he can avoid it if it gets started. He'll have to become involved.